We've hit the go live button. Let's double check. And yep, it looks like we are live.
We are live.
Welcome, everyone, to another edition, session, event. I don't know. I'm running out of names for what this thing is called, and I'm getting so confused between YouTube, which is a welcome to today's, I don't know. You get the point. It's been too busy. Yes. To the AWS Africa office hours. And the purpose of this session is to answer technical questions or questions about AWS, or even just some general technical questions from our customers and people using AWS. Mostly focus on Africa, but we are streaming on the official AWS Twitch channel as well, so we do welcome questions from pretty much anywhere. So the way that we do these sessions is that you throw questions at us, and then we start answering them. If we don't have questions, we ramble on about things that we think are interesting and fun, and we chat to the co-presenters. Now, you will hopefully recognize the two over here. You can see that Ricardo with the nice... I'm actually not sure what the blue thing in the background is behind you. Is
it's
joining us,
and then Studio Gilbrand film.
Okay. And then the other person joining us is my clone, not Quibus. So why don't you two introduce yourselves? I will let Ricardo go first.
Well, thank you very much for having me again, Cobus. And actually, just before we started, I actually did get confused between Cobus and Darkus, which was quite funny. So yes, my name is Ricardo Suarez. I work with, it's my pleasure to work with Darko and Cobus, and I'm an open source specialist. So I do the same kind of stuff that Cobus and Darko do, but I try to specialize in open source. And those from the region that might recognize the hat, this is from the Open Source Festival event that happened in February in Lagos. Great open source event. I think one of the biggest open source events that we had in Africa, but potentially broader than that. So I'm wearing that in for this. So any questions you've got about open source projects, how to do open source, or some of the open source AWS services, feel free to drop a question. So over to you, Darko.
Well, I'm unmuted. Yes. Okay. Hi. My name is Darko Mesaros, and I'm happy to be here again. I am like my both colleagues here, actually more like Cobus. I am a developer advocate based in Berlin, Germany, but I actually cover Central Eastern Europe and Russia. So I've been working with AWS for almost 5 years now. Almost time for a lovely new yellow badge, breaking that 5-year mark soon-ish. Yeah.
A well-earned one.
Huh?
A well-earned yellow badge.
Yeah, well-earned. Yeah, I moved on from premium support to solution architecture, and now I am part of the developer advocacy team. I'm originally from Serbia, so hence the weird names. So yeah.
Cool, awesome. And welcome to those that have joined us. I see we've got quite a number of people online at the moment, so maybe send us where you are joining from. We're always curious to see where people are joining us from, and also throw some technical questions at us. And while we wait for those to come in, Ricardo, I believe you had a fun one to start us off with.
Yes, thank you, Cobus. So for those folks listening in, one of the things that I like to do is, we have a leadership principle called Learn and Be Curious. And so this week I have started to learn AWS Cloud Development Kit, CDK. And I know that on this session, I have two people who are experienced in AWS CDK. So let me just first of all frame what I'm trying to do, because I think it's always important to understand why you want to do something, right? And so I'm putting a demo together with Aurora MySQL. And the gist of it is, Aurora MySQL is a modern database for modern applications. And one of the things that I thought is that, I'm showing how some of the really cool features of how it can do scaling, global databases, integrate machine learning. But then I thought, well, modern applications, cloud native applications, you don't configure through the console, right? So you write infrastructure as code to build it. So I thought, okay, wouldn't it be good if I actually just show this is how you configure and set up your database? So I thought, okay, so how do I do that? So first, I guess the first question to both of you guys is, is as a builder, there are many options you've got to automate and create your infrastructure as code. I started on AWS CDK because I wanted to try it, but it may not be the right choice, and perhaps maybe as we go deeper in this, we can figure this out. But how would you know? Maybe you could share your decision making process that you guys have when it comes to thinking about how you approach automation starting off from what you're actually trying to do.
Okay.
Well, so
there's a little bit of lag.
maybe,
Sorry.
okay, you go
Darko,
ahead.
go first. You're the guest here.
Okay,
I'm the regular boring
the
one.
guest. Okay, okay. So, well, my advice is always, and I will repeat this until I'm dead. You should absolutely use infrastructure as code, right? So, on any project you wish to do in the cloud, unless it's a very, very, I wouldn't even say that. Unless it's a very early proof of concept, I would highly advise that you kind of go into infrastructure as code and use that for deploying all the things, and even databases, right? So the only thing I would say about when it comes to databases and data sources is that if you're doing them through infrastructure as code, make sure to keep your persistent data in separate stacks, right? Or have them deployed with something else. That means if you're tearing down your application stack or something else, your persistent storage will stay somewhere else, and then you can just reference the persistent storage from an additional stack. So that would be my approach.
So that's a really good point, actually. So, and that's something that I haven't actually thought about, right? So, at the moment I've created one I'd say a mono structure, right, which does everything. Okay, and when I build it, it builds it, but when I destroy it, okay, which actually I've got to say I don't like the destroy command because it's a bit negative for me, but anyway, it deletes everything. So if I've got my database in there, my data in there, you're right, it's going to delete it, isn't it? So I need to figure out how to do that. Okay, great one.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good starting point.
That's one of the best practices when it comes to infrastructure as code. Layer your applications. Do not put all the eggs in one basket. Persistent data storage should definitely go somewhere else because you don't want to do CDK destroy and poof, data is gone. Of course, there are some tools that can prevent that, of course, but it's not the optimal approach. It's fine if you're doing an early prototype, if you're testing things out, that's perfectly fine. But going further, I would definitely advise that you separate it out of that. And when it comes to picking languages or picking frameworks which you want to use,
that's a good question as well, because I'm going Python, right? Because I'm not a developer, I'm not a programmer, but I'm okay with Python. And okay. I'm struggling a little bit with that because there's not that much reference information with Python versus.
So I have a real world example from that. When CDK first came out, I was like, oh, love it. Yes, that's the thing. I want to do Python. I'm a Python developer, or I attempt to be a Python developer. I want to do that. And then I've used CDK Python. I'm like, I can't find examples. There's no good things. How do I do this? Oh my God, it's horrible. Then I flipped back to TypeScript because there's so many examples in TypeScript. TypeScript has so many different types of examples out there. And I basically just did TypeScript until last week. And the last week I'm like, you know what? Let me go back to Python. Let me see if this works. And with my experience now in CDK, with all the examples I've done in TypeScript, it's much easier to do Python right now. So
that's a really good tip, actually.
Yeah, it's not that TypeScript is a better language for CDK. All the languages have, I believe, the same capabilities because they're all using JSII. So there is no difference from that perspective. Just the fact that there are more examples in TypeScript because that's kind of the default language people pick up.
Okay, I mean, from my perspective, it's also I come from a long Terraform use background before I joined AWS. And basically, if you look at the three flavors, CloudFormation, Terraform, and CDK, it entirely depends on what you're used to and what your background is. Because I know that Terraform, for example, is a lot more comfortable for people coming from a sysadmin type background. The reason being that because it looks like configuration files that they've dealt with before. So it feels familiar, where CDK obviously is pure programming pretty much, and programmers are very comfortable doing it that way. So yeah.
So actually, I think Cobus, I think you've touched on. I think for me, one of the pain points I'm feeling, which is like I've kind of like got this kind of like mindset of like, should I be using CloudFormation versus CDK? Because I'm not a developer, right? And so because I'm not a developer, should I default to CloudFormation? And then I'm thinking, actually, for what I'm doing, does actually my is my application more suited for CloudFormation? So I'm building I'm trying to build and configure an Aurora database. Okay, is that like a first class construct in CDK, or actually would I be better off doing something in CloudFormation? So that's the kind of the what you just said there is I'm not sure whether I should. It's always go start off with CDK, or is it a case of based on what you're trying to do, these are your options, and maybe one's going to have more preference over the other.
So
Yeah.
it's definitely a case of, I mean, if you're starting out now and you don't know either, then definitely start out with the CDK. The reason is that a lot of the best practices are built in. It's got a lot of same defaults. It really makes it easy to get going. So definitely start there. And I think break out into CloudFormation directly if you want fine-grained control, and there's specific things that for whatever reason you can't get done with the CDK. Definitely go that
Get
route.
it all done with CDK. That's the beauty
I'm
of it.
just
No,
saying.
here's the thing, and this is like a very fair point. And I was under the same impression as you were, Cobus. Like, oh, if you want fine-grained things, use CloudFormation because it has all these fine-thing elements. CDK has that as well. They're called CloudFormation constructs. So there's 3 types of things you can do in CDK. There's patterns, which are these big things where provision in 3 lines of code, you put provision an entire Fargate cluster. There are service constructs, which are your VPCs, your EC2 instances, your the things you use, right? But there's also CloudFormation constructs called, basically they're instead of a VPC, it's called CFN VPC. So basically, CloudFormation constructs use the exact same set of parameters and properties CloudFormation does. So if you want to configure all of those little nitty-gritty details, you can do it with CDK.
So
And when it comes to Aurora, Aurora's service construct, like the main construct, is currently in developer preview. So you can use it, but it is developer preview. So a higher level construct, but you can still use the CloudFormation construct to do everything you want in CDK. So I've had a change of heart. Like my advice to you right now, unless you really cannot handle programming languages, unless you really can't do that, and I doubt you can't, then you should use CDK no matter what. So
okay, and actually what you just mentioned there about the CFN constructs, okay, I've literally, it's kind of like become one of those epiphany moments, and I suddenly started seeing that a lot of people referencing these CFN things. So basically what you're saying is that, or when I see a CFN construct in AWS CDK, all it's doing is it's effectively using the native CloudFormation. Right, okay.
Because there's no CDK construct for everything, right? There is no CDK construct for all the things, and it's just a matter of it picking up, because CDK constructs are they're basically CloudFormation constructs with sensible defaults, right? So if you create a VPC in a CDK construct, it will create 4 subnets, private and public. It will do all those things for you by default. If you use a CloudFormation construct for a VPC, it will create just a VPC. So like CloudFormation.
Okay, cool.
So that's the
right. So that's great. So I think that's a really good sort of prime or starting point, I think, for that. So okay.
Yeah.
This is
the yes. We didn't pay him to ask this question.
I was an OpsWorks subject matter expert in support. So I am still this close to the service team. The entire OpsWorks service team is in Berlin, so I know them all personally. So I used to do OpsWorks was my thing for the first 2 years at Amazon. For the first 3 years in Amazon, OpsWorks was my thing. You can use OpsWorks for Chef and Puppet or Puppet in conjunction with CDK to split up responsibilities. And this is so. Just to kind of a little side note on this one, if you use OpsWorks is a system service that provisions Chef and Puppet servers or Chef and Puppet infrastructures for configuration management, for operating system configuration management. So it's the legacy way of doing things, if I can use that word. So it's if you would have a static infrastructure, static infrastructure way of doing things. So
continue. I'll debate you on that afterwards.
Okay, good. So if you have EC2 instances that are not to be configured, dynamically configured, right? But they're statically configured by the means of they're not statically configured by the means of AMI images and having it immutable. If you have instances and servers running constantly, if you have servers both on premises and in the cloud, or if you have multi-cloud servers for some reason, using Chef and Puppet is a great way to configure those things. Install packages, set up users, set up services, set up all those things. And what OpsWorks does is provision Chef and Puppet, amazing tools to do that on your behalf, and does full management of it. So it basically provisions servers, backup servers, patches servers, does all the things for you. You can just basically use AWS API to bootstrap your nodes, your EC2 instances, to these Puppet or Chef servers automatically, thanks to the power of IAM. And if you want to share responsibilities between CDK and Chef, you can do that, or Puppet, you can basically provision your infrastructure with CDK, provision opsworks, provision all the things, and then the instances themselves will be configured and managed through Chef and or Puppet. That's my take on this.
So can I ask a question on that specifically one? So is that, for example, because one of the actual problems I've currently got, okay, is I have a workstation EC2 image, okay, which I provision in my CDK script, okay, and in this I'm calling it a cloud workstation, right? Because it's like a Bastion host. No one can access it on the outside. I'm using a session manager to connect to it and then do everything I need on my Aurora database from this Linux workstation, okay. But one of the things I'm trying to do is actually make sure that all the packages I need are on that workstation. So MySQL, the sysbench, all those kind of things. And I'm actually really struggling with that on CDK at the moment. It's not working. Whatever I'm doing is not working. So typically in CloudFormation you use user data, right? In fact, actually, if you're using the console, you use user data, right? Which allows you to effectively populate a file that gets created in the provisioning process. So what you just described there, Darko, is that where you would typically, if you've got more complex things that you need to have on that workstation, I would use Opswork or to provision and manage that workstation I configure.
Well, so here's the thing: you would use Opsworks or use Chef or Puppet actually to configure a massive array of instances. A single instance, you can configure a single instance with Chef, absolutely.
Right.
Depending on the complexity of configuration, Chef may just be an overkill, right? So it's because the way you would do this on the actually, let me show something. Maybe you can see this. The way you would do this on CDK, if you have an EC2 instance. So I'm spinning up. On what am I spinning up here? It is an auto-scaling group, right? But it's the same approach to an EC2 instance. You can just add user data in 3 lines of code to that EC2 instance. Basically.
So hang on. So what you're showing me here, okay, is how to add user data to
an auto-scaling group, but it works the same way in an EC2 instance. So if you're spinning up an EC2 instance as part of your workstation, you can just have a little. Actually, give me a second.
So I'm kind of doing something similar to what you've done here. Okay, and I'll show you maybe.
I have a user data script that installs Apache for me, nothing special, right? And this is basically just reading that user data script off a disk, right? It's loading it as a file using library, using TypeScript, basically read file sync, reading that file into a variable, and then passing that variable literally as a parameter to the add user data method to the auto-scaling group. Now, this is an auto-scaling group, but it can also be, instance or whatever, right? So
I think the important part here, Ricardo, is that, like Darko mentioned, using Chef and Puppet, I mean, I do like overkill sometimes, so I've got Chef managing my one server at home because I was bored one Friday night, don't ask. But what I would recommend is this approach is actually very sane, because what you can do here is that as you go along and figure out that you forgot to install something, just continuously locally, as you configure that server by hand, pop it into the script locally. Because at the end of the day, you can go full automation, but that'll actually be quite a lot of effort for something you might only do once off. And given that you're treating this like a workstation, it kind of makes sense if you say, well, let me make it at least somewhat reproducible if whatever happens and I accidentally delete it. But I mean, if you want to really get that going, I mean, going to a cycle of configuring it and adding and rebuilding and adding and rebuilding. I mean, I would almost, given that you are a bit more familiar with Python, recommend that you take a look at Ansible, because specifically just for installing packages, you can get started very, very quickly. So that might be an easier way, and you can just constantly run it until you're happy.
Yeah, so and I think you're right. I think that's a good thing for me to think about. Is I it is only a workstation. It's not hundreds or fleets of them, right? So I think this approach would work. Now, Darko, this is the approach you've just mentioned is what I'm trying to do. So this is one of the inner samples. So you can see my screen here. What you can see here is me loading.
Sorry, Ricardo, can you just make it slightly bigger? Just like one or two.
Sure. Okay, let's.
There we go.
Is that
I think one less.
It's better.
Okay, one less. Okay.
There we go. Perfect. That's good. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Right. So.
Okay.
One more higher.
I think, sorry, one high. Sorry, there we go. Yeah, that's perfect. I'm just worried about
Okay, all right.
if there's a little bit of a bitrate issue. Cool.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So what I've done is I've got so the first challenge I had, okay, was when you look at all the examples for Python and CDK is that they all provision standard Amazon Linux, and I wanted Ubuntu. Okay. So the first thing is I need to figure out how to do that, and actually it wasn't as straightforward as I thought, because what I thought was just you just need to pass in the AMI for the region.
Oh.
But when I did this, okay, initially, what happened was I would get this error saying AMI mapping file does not exist for the region, and that's because when you actually in your app.py, you have to actually specify the region. So that caught me out for that. That took me probably about half a day to fix that issue, right? Which I guess if
you don't have to if you have. Well, you know what? To be honest, I may be wrong. So I have my region defined in the.
Me too. I do have those environment variables, and it still didn't work for some reason, right? And I didn't understand why. So, but this fixed it. So basically, just parsing the region into the construct, that fixes that problem. That fixed that problem. So then, once I did that, I was able to get an Ubuntu image up. But then, in order to actually effectively create my user data, I used one of the samples that we've got on the CDK, which basically says create a configure script. So here's my configure script, okay, which basically does a lot of the stuff I want to get installed in this instance. Okay, so all the software, and what it's doing is it's kind of like it's uploading it to a temporary bucket, I'm assuming, and then granting read access before executing. And when you do a CDK synth, okay, you can actually see it in the CloudFormation. But what's interesting, okay, is that when this runs, first of all, the CDK deploy works. Okay, it deploys, the workstation gets run, but none of this stuff, okay, is there, right? And so then it kind of like comes to how do you then actually sort of troubleshoot? But I don't want to say I don't want to consume too much time. So it's just something that I'm currently working through. So for people who are listening, is that it's been an interesting kind of experience so far learning this, and I think, like you said, Darko, it is something that is important, which is why I'm persevering and I'm learning lots. And I think this is definitely the right path to do.
No, absolutely. And this is one of the this is the same thing I've ran into when I started doing Python for CDK. Is the example of doing user data is weird. Is they use this S3 download command thing, but actually after digging some bit more into the documentation, I figured out that you can do this. Basically, I've read user data script from a file, from an asset, basically just reading it into a variable, nothing else, and then using the add user data method here to pass on that same thing. So works the exact same way. There's no requirement for like a temporary S3 bucket. I mean, it's all handled for you, right? But it's for me, this is much cleaner because this just adds user data to this is an auto-scaling group, but again, it will work for the same thing for an EC2 instance. So that's how I did it here. So
awesome. Okay,
it's very simple.
So what I'm going to suggest is if there are people viewing that are really interested in the CDK, wow, sorry, the sun just went behind the cloud. Come and join Darko myself on Mondays and Fridays at 11 a.m. So an hour earlier than today. We play with CDK pretty much the whole time at the moment, and that's a good place to actually learn a bit more about that. Jumping back to the questions, please send us the questions via the comments. We are literally here to answer some questions. And I'm actually going to grab two ones that I've had now in the community and one with on Twitter as well around Cognito. So it'll be interesting to see if any of you know the answer to this. The first one is around Cognito and the permission roles that is assigned. Basically, the person asked me if that there's a mechanism in place that you can set the precedence for which role it picks to apply in terms of permission sets for the Cognito user, and whether or not you can disable that. So it feels like a fuzzy match, which by default, I'd almost want to say, no, I don't expect that to be something that Cognito would do, because normally the way the rule systems work is that you have whatever the first cache one is, that's the one that grabs it, and that's how the precedence is done. So
Cobus, can you explain that a little bit differently, because I'm not sure I follow. So are you saying that when you're using Cognito and you've got different user pools, that you so for example, let's say I'm using Facebook as an identity provider and Amazon as a identity provider, that you basically, that's how you go prioritize from one to the other? Is that what you're saying?
So what I want to do quickly is I'm just pulling up the exact tweet that I received, because I'm also in the process of trying to still work my, through the exactly what it is. So the person said, when using tokens to assign roles to a user, can multiple roles be assigned to a user rather than using precedence to assign the best role to a user? In case of, for example, financial role and operational role, there's not necessarily a precedence. So my understanding here is that the person, so I don't know Cognito that well, and that's why I'm quite curious if one of you knows it well enough to know if you can assign multiple different roles, or if there's a mechanism in place that say when a person logs in, depending on something, and I don't know what that something is, you get one set of credentials, which personally, I don't feel that that's normally how authorization works, authentication and authorization systems, when you think about the permissions sets that you set up, works. So my gut feel says no, because also fuzzy based on the context seems like you'd rather have a join mechanism for the different permission sets, and then you get one overall permission set, and that applies, period.
Yeah, I'm not a deep Cognito expert. I've used it in various demos to do things like provide anonymous identities for incoming requests. But apart from that, I don't know the answer to this one.
Likewise, I'm really not by any means an expert on Cognito. I've used it maybe once, but it's an interesting. It's a definitely an interesting question. And what does apply? What is the first thing that applies?
Well, that's the thing.
Is it the
I'm still in the process. Well, the way I understand these systems usually, and this is now with a caveat, this is usually security-based systems, is that deny rules take precedence over allow rules. So let's say I've got two sets, and it's not necessarily which one is loaded first. It's a question of what's the combined permission that I get.
Exactly.
So if, for example, I've got a allow read permission, and I've got a allow read and write permission. When they're merged, because they both are allows, you'll get the sum, which is the allow for both read and write. Whereas if you had, for example, one set that said read, disallow write, and the other one is just read. The other one is read and write. Then you'll only end up with read because there's an explicit disallow portion.
Right. Okay. Well, so yeah. I mean, my experience again from standard security things like coming from Microsoft is it's a combination of two permission models where the explicit denies have precedence, right? So if you have an explicit deny of something, that's an explicit deny. So that's why explicit denies are important to have. It's not just you hope that's going to be the case. So yeah, but I would assume, assume that it's the same thing with Cognito. I mean, I see no reason why it would be different. So, but yeah.
So do we know what the actual use case is? So what is? Did they provide any details as to what's
that little bit that I read? I still am in the process of reaching out to them and getting some more info, and also digging into Cognito a little bit, because like I said, it's not something I've played with a lot. I used it on one or two small projects, but just basically the defaults. I didn't fiddle with it.
Yeah, because I think when you start getting into federated identities and multiple providers, it can get tricky and complicated quite quickly, right? Because what if, I mean, I've got a Facebook identity, I've got an Amazon identity, and I've got a Google identity, right? If I use all those identities in one federated identity provider, which one does it use? If it's all keying off my email address, do I get different credentials based on each of them, or does it somehow manage to?
I would expect it not to, because remember the whole point of those type of OAuth interactions is that your identity, the authentication part is like I'm who I say I am, which is Ricardo, and that's tied to the email address, and that other third-party system just verifies that you legally have access, or you are the owner of that specific email address, and then from there I think it's the same. They might pull some additional info from whatever provider you're dealing with, for example, let's say first name, last name, and profile pic, which is not necessarily available on every single one that you integrate with, but from a usage perspective, it just is the authentication part. I've never seen anybody do authorization based on which social provider you use.
No, agreed. Sorry, maybe I explained that wrong. So I'm thinking from the point of view of signing up and registering my identity with one of these providers. When you've got your identity provider pool, depending on how that identity provider manages the different, let's say, data points. Okay, and the key, which is normally, like you said, is normally the email address because it's assumed to be unique. I know in the past, this is not with Cognito, but I've done quite a fair bit of work with things like Integrity SiteMinder, but building federated identities. I've done ADFS as well, and how you manage, for example, similar email addresses from different organizations when they're federated together can be quite a tricky challenge.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one. I think, what I'll do is let me make a note here on the side. I've started doing that for the different session shows, things that I do, and we will hopefully be able to come back to our viewers next week with an answer on that. Cool. Okay. The other interesting question that I had here, and I believe Darko will probably know the answer, is one of your other favorite projects, AWS Code Artifacts. Sorry, I'm just pulling it up over here.
Okay.
Which was, where did it go? Boom, 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 boom. Do you need to regenerate a token every 12 hours, or does it auto regen if you continue to use it? Similar to some of the, I know some JWT tokens and some other systems have, if I've got a token and I keep using the token, my session keeps staying alive because it automatically refreshes in the background, versus if I let it effectively expire, then does it or not? Because I have no idea how the expiration mechanism in Code Artifact works.
You have to call the login command periodically. By default, it's 12 hours. So you have to call the login command periodically for you to be still logged in. So that's what you need to do. So according to the documentation, actually to the API, so let me have a look here.
So this is where you're basically, from your infrastructure as code, you might be, for example, deploying some artifacts that are stored in the Code Artifact repository. Is that what the question is?
Well, so yeah, a Code Artifact here in this case, right? Code Artifact is a repository where you can store your artifacts coming from Python pip, npm, and one more thing. I forgot what it is.
Ruby gems, or
Ruby gems? I'm not sure. It's
NuGet.
Something Java based.
Oh, Maven.
Oh, Maven.
Maven then.
I think it's Maven. Yeah, Maven. Yeah.
Yeah. There we go. Yeah.
And it's just the fact that you can store your modules that you make and have there. So it's like a local repository.
So you configure your build systems rather than to go to the internet. You go through the
exactly,
and that acts as a proxy effectively, like a cache proxy.
Exactly, a cache proxy. It can cache external projects as well. So external modules. So you have you don't have an external dependency to those things. Actually, external network dependencies, because this is sitting in AWS. But you can also push your own packages to there to be exclusively there, so you can reach them. The only thing is that when you run the get authorization token API call, basically it gets an authentication token for accessing those repositories for that specific domain, and they are by default valid for 12 hours, and they need to be you need to call the login command periodically just to refresh the token. As long as you have the permissions, you have to do it. So, I mean, I would advise you, if you're running this in a CI/CD pipeline, just do the login every time you execute it, right? So, and that should be fine.
What I'm going to ask is, Ricardo, maybe take 2-3 minutes quickly telling us about that open source conference you went to in Lagos, because that gives me a gap now to quickly switch back to my noise cancelling headphones, because I'm extremely distracted this side by the weed eater and lawnmower directly outside my window. I cannot hear myself think, so it's like that's why I'm keeping doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to talk about it. So yeah, it was actually back in towards the end of February, actually. I think it might have even been the last event that I attended because of the before the COVID lockdown. I know that the COVID was beginning to sort of like get a lot of more news, but so it was one of those ones where, you know, should I or shouldn't I go? But because of the passion behind the community that was behind the Open Source Festival, I decided to, you know, go there and you know, sort of meet loads of great people from the region. I did a number of talks. So one of the talks I did was around how we think about open source at Amazon, and then the other was a more technical workshop where I did a AWS RoboMaker workshop. So helping kind of the students. It was a lot of students actually there. There's quite a few startups as well, and we basically all built a robot using the open source ROS Gazebo tools that form part of AWS RoboMaker. Now, The actual open source festival ran for I think 4 days. So it was Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. They had speakers from all over the world come. It was very, very well organized. Samson Goody, who was kind of one of the sort of chief instigators of the Open Source Festival, was front and center of this. Great keynote speakers, loads of technical sessions. So when I wasn't speaking and chatting to people, I attended a lot of the sessions. Okay, and it was great to see the kind of the interest in open source in the region. It was great to see the kind of the difference in approach, the difference in session. Very technical. In fact, actually, I learned loads from a technical perspective of some of the things they were talking about. I think some of the sessions are actually now available. I seem to recall on Twitter every now and then I see an open source festival link. I actually was fortunate enough to do some interviews with some of the builders, actually talking about what their projects were. So there was one startup who were based in Lagos, who had created a new MVC framework for Python, and they were talking about why they did it and why you should start using it and what they're trying to achieve, which is basically get wider adoption and more community contributions. But yeah, it was a great event. Like I said, I think they had about over 800 people just to set the scene and the scale of this event. It's nice to meet people from a different region who've got different outlooks to using the technology, the open source software. And also one of the interesting things is that, as always, it's, and this is kind of why I kind of miss the physical events, is that, between sessions, you had the chance to bump into people, you see the side conversations and chat about, what are you doing with tech? And, there was so many of those great conversations, huddles of people talking about, well, what did you learn from that session, or which session are you going to next? And so I kind of miss that. And I think that's why I think physical events probably will come back, because, you can't currently replicate that.
I'm sure. It's
so
how they call it, the third session, the external session, when people
exactly
hallway track.
Yes. Yeah.
Hallway tracks are just the best.
Yeah. So I think, this was, I think, the second time they were doing it. But certainly, if it moves virtual, if they're running it again, I think it's definitely something that people should look out for and attend if they can.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry for stepping away there. My dog decided that she must absolutely go out to the door, and then 10 seconds later decided that she absolutely must come back in.
Yeah, that's the law of dogs. I have the same.
Yeah.
I have the same with mine.
Yeah.
Normally, it's actually they go to the door, and you open the door, and they just look at you like, "Why did you open the door?" So you close the door, and then you go back.
Awesome. I'm going to paste a link here from Graham that he sent in the chat about a open source book from Amazon. I posted a note which...
Okay.
Yeah, I must actually look at it. I was not aware of this.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this is going to be interesting. So the only one I'm familiar with is open source in the enterprise, which I actually helped put together from... it's an O'Reilly book. Oh, what's that?
Self-promo jar. Aha.
Oh, do I have to put something in there? do I have to put a coin in there? Oh no, slap wrist.
I'm just teasing. No. We've got ongoing thing. It's fine. You must just. I expect either a euro or a pound at a time.
Okay, all right.
I'll put a rand in at a time.
Okay, so what happens when the self promotion jar gets full? What happens?
Cobus goes and buys some beers, which he shares virtually with the team by sitting there and drinking them and telling them about the beer.
Of course, it's virtually.
Yeah.
No.
So did you say that you had the link for the book?
Yes, I just pasted it there in the chat, I think.
I can't see it.
Graham actually passed that book. You in StreamYard, can you not see it on the comments tab? You should be able to, not the private chat, the comments chat.
Okay, right. Okay, I can see
there we go.
Now,
yeah.
right.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
cool.
so that book, that is the one that I actually, so I'm not going to say it because I don't want to self-promote, but that is the one I am familiar with.
Oh no, please do. I'm more than happy.
So it's a great book. Okay, you should definitely go out. And actually it's less of a book and more of a thin kind of like pamphlet type thing. I actually have got physical copies of that. So if anyone's interested in getting a physical copy, then they can drop you a note, and I will when I go back to the office, I can ship some out. But these are available online as well. And what this book shows you is how to start thinking about open source if you work for an organization, okay? Because quite often what happens is organizations don't really understand open source, and therefore they're not really making the most use of it. And so this book starts to help you as an organization, as a business, put together the bits and pieces you need so that you can manage and get the most of open source.
But I mean, Ricardo, isn't open source just a case of people putting software on somewhere that you can install for free, and then when you've got an issue, you go log a request and they have to fix it for you? Isn't that how it works?
That's I think you know what, I think if you were to ask a lot of people, that's probably what they'd say. But really, open source is kind of like two things, I think. The first thing is it's a legal innovation. Okay, it provides a mechanism by which developers, builders can easily share stuff they create with other people and be in control of how they share it. Okay, through a set of reusable legal constructs, so licenses. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing, it's the people and community element. Okay, it's the actual processes and mechanisms that people have developed over time that help them collaboratively develop the code. So that's, for me, that's what open source is. It's those two things. Those two things happen to be very, very powerful. And as an organization, so I do a session called Gaining Strategic Advantage Through Open Source. And it's about shifting the conversation from just doing developers to, what I call is, who is your chief open source officer, right? Who is the person in your organization that's trying to use open source levers to help you as a business, get a competitive advantage in this digital world we've got. So I'll stop there, because I can talk all day about this.
That's actually an interesting one. I think it might actually be worthwhile trying to schedule a full session with you just to go all of this, because there's a lot of info in that. And I mean, we haven't even touched on the whole, let's have a discussion around the licenses and what they mean and how you interpret them and all that. So what I'll do is I'll also, let me add that once again to my show notes. See, I'm getting organized.
I mean, absolutely. If there's an interest in this community for that, and actually, I was just talking about the Lagos session. Okay, so I did talk about that. The first part of my presentation actually was about what is open source. What is a license? How do you use these licenses? What does it mean to you? That kind of thing.
Okay, awesome. I think that'll be great. So once again, for those that have joined us, I see we have had a couple of new joiners in the last few minutes. This is the weekly AWS Africa office hours, where I am joined by colleagues, and I'm currently I just poked a couple of them this morning, some local solution architects, to help answer your technical questions. So if you have any, please throw them at us. And yeah, we will see where the conversation flows. And we actually have a comment over here.
Yes, so that actually is a very good comment, actually, and I concur. I very much concur with this, and it's certainly what I see. Right, is that I think that for a lot of businesses, they think open source is the stuff that the techies work on. Right, it's stuff that developers need to think about, and I think that certainly shows the initial awareness of open source at a business level, but it also shows a lack of real understanding of what open source can do for the business.
I must say, I found it very interesting, like a few years back, with the first time when I also had the impression that, open source is purely code, nothing else. And then I started seeing companies open sourcing for example, their employee handbook and different parts of how they operate, which is a very interesting way of approaching it and sharing that information.
Yeah. So actually, there's a follow-on question from Perkinge. I'm not sure how to say that. Perkinge. From the point of view, so actually, I'm not going to say. I'm very careful now. I'm aware of the jar, so I'm not going to self-promote. But there is a session that Maya might have done.
You may have done. There we go.
Yeah. So I'll try and post a link to it. There's a video where I actually talk in detail about this. So I think we talk about this in the context as there is sometimes you hear on Twitter and some of the other things that open source is a business model, but I want to be very clear that open source is not a business model. Okay, open source is a set of tactics and levers that you as a business can use. So you have to have a good business model first, right? before you start blaming open source for failing. Okay, from the point of view of kind of how this can be effective in as an open source being effective in open source, I can take two very quick examples. The first one is the one that typically you start off with, which is, if you're a business that needs technical talent, then you need to hire the best engineers that you can hire. You need to attract the best engineers you can have, and also you need to keep those best engineers. So how do you do that as a business? Now, it turns out that open source and doing open source is a really good way of hanging on to and attracting. So Trivago is a well-known website for helping people find hotels and holidays. Now, they early on, and it's kind of a bit of an accident, they started sponsoring Webpack events, and very soon the community started saying, "Oh, let's go and work for Trivago because they sponsor, they understand open source. If we want to do Webpack, we'll go to Trivago." And so very quickly they started gaining expertise and excellence in this area. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, if you want to enter a new market or that you don't typically have, and I've worked with customers before joining AWS on this, open source is a really good way to provide what's called a complement approach. So if you look at Intel sell chips, but they spend a lot of time and a lot of engineers contributing to the Linux kernel, right? Because they know that more people have got running Linux with optimized Intel code sells more servers that run Intel chips. If you look at other kind of companies that produce software, it's a similar pattern, right? It's that you can effectively create an environment where more people want your product. So that's just two very quick examples.
Cool, awesome. Let me quickly check here. So just quick, complete side notes here is the comment from. Once again, I don't know how to pronounce this, but it's a new. So that picture that we actually see over there is the physical structure, and what this is a blah 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 cells, also called Purkinje neurons, are neurons in vertebrate animals located in the cerebellar cortex of the brain. These are cell bodies shaped like a flask and have many thread-like extensions called dendrites. So they will learn something completely new today.
So, and also, I'm not sure if this was deliberate, but that there is a great open source project from AWS called the Neuron SDK. So it all comes back to open source, whichever way you look at it.
But if this is so, this thing was kind of thought by a Czech scientist. So basically, it was discovered by a Czech anatomist, Jan Evangelista Purkinje. So it's pronounced Purkinje.
I love the way you sound.
NJ is the ñ sound in Czech, so Purkinje.
Purkinje.
Although in Afrikaans we round our R's a bit more, so I'm struggling with that.
Purkinje.
We actually have a local dialect. Well, it's not quite a dialect, but a way. Yeah, it's dialect. Sorry, brain's not working. Where they constantly roll the R's. So instead of saying like work, it'll be work.
Work. Okay.
Yeah.
For me, rolling those kind of, the back rolling of the R's, like in German, is so difficult. That's why I don't speak German. I don't have that in my language. We pronounce R's like the Spanish do. We say R.
So, yeah. And even in one language, okay, like Spanish, okay, they pronounce the letters and words differently. Whether you're in Spain versus South America, I spent a couple of years in South America working there, and the Spanish they speak there is so different, both the words and the way they say. And so, people would look at me and they would stare hard at me, trying to figure out, what's he speaking? Yeah. And
wait till you try and learn Nkosa, which is consists of a couple of different clicking sounds in your mouth. So that one is where you put your tongue against your palate and then pull it down again to make it. Awesome. And there's another one where you flip it against your front teeth, and then there's another one where you're like pulling something. Let's say you've got something stuck between your teeth. That kind of tongue action. So there are different clacks to it as well. And those are just the three I know. So it's sometimes very interesting learning new languages where your mouth physically is not used to making those movements.
Yeah. For me, English, because I'm so exposed to English, I know how to pronounce American English with all the words and we don't have those sounds in my language at all. So it was weird. Even the W sound, the W sound, is something I would never use in my language. We have the V sound, which is V, and that's it. Yeah, and Bavarian German is a weird German in itself. I heard it a few times.
So
it's like
Give me explain to me what this is, because I mean, remember, I'm down in Cape Town, Southern Hemisphere, so
Yeah. So Bavarians have their own version of German, and it's like a Bayerisch Deutsch, and it's a completely. I don't know how it sounds. Like I don't know German in general. So, but I know Bayerisch Deutsch or Bavarian German sounds different. It sounds very weird when you listen to it. It's like it seems German, but something is very off with that German. So at least that's my experience, because it's something that, like, I don't know German. If I would understand German fully, I can say, oh yeah, it's different because X, Y, and Z. But for me, it's just like, okay, almost German is like you kind of sense that it's German, but it's not. So, and they do have strong front rolls of R, so they are like that as well. So. But no, even Austrian for me, I initially, like when I moved to Germany, I couldn't sense the Austrian accent at all, because again, I don't speak the language. But now that I'm exposed to German, I can hear Austrian. Austrian has a very weird accent, even for me who doesn't understand. It's not as weird as Bayerisch, but it's weird.
You get that with Portuguese as well, because where I come from in Spain, we actually don't speak Spanish. We speak Gallego, which is like 90 to 95% Portuguese. Wow. And then I've got lots of Portuguese friends, and I spent some time in Africa. I went to Mozambique, Angola, and the version of Portuguese they is very different as well. And then I spent some time, like I said, I spent some time in Brazil, and there it's like, whoa, slow down. I can't, if you speak slowly, you can just about get it. But so the same language, they haven't really changed the language. It's just the speed, that they speak and how they pronounce the letters. So you struggle. And the same with programming languages, right? They're all very similar, but
absolutely,
just different enough to cause issues.
We should call some of the languages dialects, because some of the things are very similar. I think TypeScript and JavaScript are just dialects of the same one. So
you often refer to SQL dialects.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that. All right, that's interesting. Yeah. SQL dialects.
Yeah, because you get ANSI SQL, MS SQL, P SQL. Yeah.
Yeah, you know what? That always confuses me, because I'm not a DBA or database person, but understanding the SQL programming language is more complicated because of that. Because if you look at an example, if you're doing something like in Athena and you want to create SQL to do something, it only supports a subset, doesn't it, of SQL? Yeah. So you need to know, okay, so it's SQL, but it's only a subset of the commands SQL supported. So I struggle with that whole thing, right? It's much more complicated than it needs to be.
Yeah. So I heard you all say SQL, and I said SQL. I didn't find out about SQL or the pronouncing of that word as SQL until like 5 years ago. Right? I would always say SQL. For me, that was SQL, and even in Serbian, I would say SQL. Right? That's not SQL. And then I heard someone say SQL. I'm like, SQL? What is SQL? Oh, I would thought like SQL the next part. I'm like, okay,
but I'm the same actually.
So just to keep things very, very clear, this applies to things like SQL. It does not apply to AMI. We don't say AMI.
You don't say AMI.
We do not.
No, you don't say AMI. No.
In fact, actually, you will not be allowed on this webcast if you
say AMI.
Live stream webcast is later today.
All right, sorry.
No, sorry, that's the webinar.
I am. So AMI. I mean, I heard people say AMI, right? And it said AMI to me. I'm like, what? AMI. So no, some. Of the
I just ignore people that say AMI.
Speaking of other recordings, completely off the track, because I see we don't have any questions. I'm currently. It's one of the things I'm struggling with the most is trying to figure out, firstly, what day of the week, just because we've been working from home so long, but more or harder for me is trying to figure out where in the year we are. Because what's happening is that often I do recordings that might be like 3-4 weeks in advance already, but then you reference the time frame when it's going to go live. And because your brain is in that mode, and then you jump to something else, and then you've got something, let's say I'm recording it for later today, or like that, it just feels like I'm time traveling the whole time, and I can't figure out what month I'm in anymore. Because I know today's a good example where this is live. I have got a webinar later today, which was pre-recorded earlier this week. And then I've got a YouTube video that I'm launching later today that's already pre-scheduled that I recorded this morning and edited this morning. So it's just like, I have no idea where I'm at the moment.
Yeah, I think we're that sounds so familiar. I know. I'm kind of using whether the days are getting longer or shorter as my basic measure, right? as to
That
how
doesn't
far
help
we are.
because we don't even have that much variance with our winter and summer sun. It's like a maybe 2 hours, I think. If I had to guess now.
Well, actually, it's weird. So, I was up on holiday in Scotland, in the north of the UK, right? And I was looking at the sunset and sunrise times. Okay, and what's really weird is so I live in the furthest south of the UK, on a coastal town. Okay, and I was actually as far as you can in the Highlands in Scotland, and there was like a 30-minute change in the sunset and sunrise times, and I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. And because it was past the equinox, so it's supposed to be the days are getting shorter. I assumed that that the time would be longer here in the south, but actually it wasn't. It was actually 20. You got, I think we worked out you had 40 minutes more daylight in Scotland than you had in the UK.
No, absolutely.
Oh, wow.
It's vastly different. So I mean, I live in north of Germany, in Berlin, and here during the summer. Or I used to live in Dublin, for example. That was even worse. I mean, it's nothing close to like the Nordics, but I used to live in Dublin, and in the summer you get sunrise at 4 a.m. in the morning, and the sun goes down at like 11, 10:30 in the evening, and in the winter just like sun goes down at 6 p.m. or no, sorry, 4 p.m. and goes up at like 9. So for me, that's an extreme. I used to come from South Europe, and South Europe we had differences, but not as massive as those things. So it's weird.
Yeah, so I actually just pulled it up here quickly for South Africa. So in the middle of winter, our sunrise is 7:52, and in summer it's 5:27. So that's what 2.5 hours difference only.
That's not much.
So generally by 8 a.m. we always have sun at 8 a.m. and we always still have sun by 5:45. So.
Ricardo, there's a question here. That
So a couple of questions. So yes, and so I have actually heard. So there's a great open source event called the Open Source Summit, and in December last year, it was held in Paris. Unfortunately, because of the strikes in Paris, it was not so well attended. But they actually had two stalls of people creating open source hardware, and they actually had designs that you could actually access by. And actually, we've just had an advocate in the US actually start, Brittany, and she's got interested in open source hardware. So maybe we could get her along and talk to her about her interest in open source hardware. So I'm familiar certainly with something. It's not something I to be honest, that I've professional.
Somebody asked if I'm wearing these headphones. Yes, I am. The best headphones in the world.
Ooh, Darko cut his hair.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, me too. And I got rid of the beard. I was getting concerned that I was morphing into you two, so I had to.
What's wrong with
do
that?
something about
What's wrong with that?
So yeah, so just to finish off the answer. So I'm familiar with it, and I'm aware of some of the stuff that people like Facebook have been doing around open sourcing their hardware and networking designs. But apart from that, I've always thought of it's more of a hobbyist thing for my own interest, really.
Yeah, I'm a fan of open source hardware. I like when people actually, share their open source hardware, especially now that you have so many ways of doing like PCB printing en masse and PCB printing for a very cheap price. Getting an open source hardware out there that you can build at home. I'm a big fan of that, even though I'm not an expert in building hardware. But I think with the vast availability of 3D printers and the ability to print your PCBs at a very cheap price out there, I printed PCBs by hand 20 years ago for school. I did like some projects, but printing PCB by hand is possible, but it's a day event.
Yeah.
So,
but I think also one of the big changes has been that you now can get, because previously if you try to build your own PCB, you tended to have to go very low level with the coding that you wanted to use on it. Like ANSI C and those kind of things. I remember doing PIC-C programming on those chips and things, which was it was very difficult. And nowadays you can just pop on like a chip that can run Node.js if you wanted to.
I have one of those.
And there's also open source projects as well.
Yeah.
There's lots of open source projects that that do from embedded Linux projects, so like Yocto, to FreeRTOS, which obviously we know is an Amazon open source project. Just kind of finishing off again. So from the point of view of, do you think that we need a different scheme of open source collaboration? Well, actually, I'm not sure we do, because if you look at things like Thingsverse, right, it's already provided. Thingsverse is like the GitHub for hardware, open hardware, where people share designs, they collaborate on designs. I guess the difference is that, whereas everyone can have a computer and install the software, not everyone can 3D print something. So there's some differences, although there are, you can go to probably most cities and there'll be a 3D fabricator somewhere where you can actually just, for a very small amount of money, you can have some time there and then print off either a PCB or a 3D printed design. So I think that some of the elements are the same, but the output is obviously going to be slightly different.
Okay, well, with that, we are on the hour, which means that we unfortunately have to end this now, but this was a lot of fun again. So firstly, thank you to Ricardo and Darko for joining me today. It's always fun having you on the show.
Thank you.
And
thank you for helping me with my CDK.
No, pleasure. I mean, there's also the session on Mondays and Fridays at 11 a.m. I've heard there's a lot of CDK that goes on there.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll be there.
Oh, and just before we quickly close off the session, I had a realization yesterday that for those that have watched Magnum PI back in the day, he was actually practicing for this year, where we all had to wear masks. Because if you watch his videos and you just do this, you'll see that he's very expressive.
Okay. Wow.
So with that, thank you very much for joining us today. You can join us again next week, and I will let you know who else is joining me. I'm trying to rotate some people, and I am poking and prodding to get some extra people in here. Darkers and Ricardo, you're obviously also welcome, always, but I've heard people like to see different people sometimes.
Ricardo, he wants to say that we're no longer welcome.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. We can get the hint.
We can get the hint. It's fine.
I've already booked you for 2 weeks from now. Don't worry.
Okay, everyone.
Cool.
Thanks.